Hi, my name's Mick Grewcock and I'm a UK-based self-taught amateur bowyer, and in this series of videos I hope to show you how you can make your very first wooden bow. In video 1 I showed you the tools I used when I started making bows. Some or all of these tools will help you make your first wooden bow. But many of these tools have companions that make working on wooden bows much easier. And I call these helpful items aids to bow making. And these items will help you when you're shaping and making your first wooden bows. They're not essential items, but I do find they make the process of making a wooden bow much easier. When I started bow making, I had nothing except some of the tools that I have showed you. But in the last 2 years, I have found life was made a lot easier when I got some help in the form of 5 useful aids. So here, to help you start your bow making career, are the 5 aids that I found most useful when I started making wooden bows. Perhaps the most useful aid when you start working on wooden bows is some method of gripping and holding securely the wood whilst you're working upon it. Today I'm using an engineer's vise. It's mounted on an old wooden pallet, and this is secured to a tree. If you're using a vise with serrated jaws, please do put something between the jaws and the wood that you're working on to prevent damage to your valuable bow stave. A great alternative to a vise is a shave horse. It's a foot operated vise. They've been around for hundreds upon hundreds of years. It enables you to use the power of your feet and legs to grip a stave and work upon it easily and efficiently. And if you'd like a project, why not make a shave horse? They're very easy to build, you can do so out of scrap materials, and it'll probably take you no more than a day and give you some great experience with some of the tools that I talked about in the first video. It's really useful to have some means of measuring and marking the wood that you're working upon. I use these typically, and also a marker pen. That's a caliper, a steel ruler and a wooden ruler. All useful, all really inexpensive, many of which you might well find around your home anyway. Why not check out eBay and local second-hand markets? There you can often find vintage rulers and calipers. They're not only nice to look at, but lovely to use and to own. One of the challenges of making a wooden self-bow is a process called tillering. That is the sharing out of the load across the entire bow or across the working limbs, depending upon the design that you're making. And a great aid to that process is this. It's called a tillering tree. Making a tillering tree or a tillering post is a very easy DIY project. I use a piece of wood 6 foot long, 3 inches wide and 1 inch deep, and built on it a shelf. The shelf supports the bow, and on the stem of the tree I've marked inches of draw length, up to a maximum of 32 inches. At the foot of the tillering tree is a pulley through which I pass a cord which is attached to the bowstring. I can then stand back from the bow and gradually draw the bow and see the shape. This system can be refined by the addition of a hanging scale. This enables me to also see the draw weight as I'm pulling on the bow. When making bows I always try to use hand tools, but there are occasions when I will use a power tool, and perhaps one of the most valuable when I started out making bows was one of these. This is a heat gun. Now obviously I can't use that in the wood here, but I can use it at home, and it's a really useful device if you need to straighten your bow. They're inexpensive, they're easy to obtain, easy to use, and they're very efficient when it comes to straightening your bow if you end up with a wonky piece of wood. I'll explain in more detail in a future video how I use a heat gun. And finally, perhaps the most undervalued asset in my opinion when it comes to making wooden bows are these, your fingers. And these things don't need any training. Your fingers can detect bumps and hollows, they can assess tapers, they can warn you if you're making part of the bow too thick or too thin. These are, without doubt, the most vital but most overlooked aids when it comes to bow making. You'll also find as you progress through making your first bows that you'll need some basic materials, something from which to make strings, various grades of sandpaper, linseed or vegetable oil, and beeswax. Later in the series I will show you these items in detail. And remember your health when you're making wooden bows. If you're creating dust, wear a face mask. And if there's any risk of flying splinters of wood, wear safety glasses. So I've shown you some of the tools and aids that make life easier when you're working on wooden bows, and I've given you a heads up on some of the materials that we'll be using later on in the process. And I'll give more details of those in later videos. And now we face our first and perhaps biggest challenge of bow making, and that is where to find wood from which to make bows. I'll cover that in detail in the next video. But for now, why not check out this video in which I go on a quest for bow woods in the UK countryside.